And welcome. It's episode number 32 of The Rent Roll, your podcast on all things rental housing. We talk about apartments, SFR, and BTR here. We talk about investments, operations, policy, equity, debt, development, the whole gamut. And today, we're going to be talking about construction and policy and advocacy around it. We'll talk about where apartment supply levels are today, where they're going, how quickly that supply pipeline is drying up. And a couple of things here. Number one, it's going to back up the mainstream investment thesis that supply is dropping off, and that'll allow for some recovery, assuming the economy is in good shape. But also, number two, it'll highlight the need from a policy perspective for more supply. You know, some people like to say that we're oversupplied, overbuilt, and that's just not true. You know, we have had a short-term mismatch of supply and demand, with the supply hitting the highest levels in 40 years. You know, but some people forget that, you know, when you build this much supply this fast, it's hard to absorb it as it comes in, right? It tends to be concentrated in similar locations at similar price points. And also in the short term, people are in temporary living arrangements that may not plan to be in long term. That represents pent-up demand. But in the meantime, they have to, maybe they're on living through a current lease. They need to wait till it expires. Maybe they're living with family and friends until the timing is right. But that pent-up demand is there. The structural undersupply is still there in many markets. And we see areas across the country that have not built supply that still have a need for it. And we also see, obviously there was a lot of apartments built in the 70s and 80s that are now 40, 50 plus years old, if not older, if they're building before that, and they're aging into obsolescence every year, and that creates a need for more stock. So it's all cyclical. And before you know it, we'll be talking about undersupply again, because so little has been breaking ground of late, long before tariff issues even made headlines. So, and when we don't have enough supply, that's when we start to see pushes for disproven Band-Aid fixes like rent control that just exacerbate the problems for renters and, of course, create challenges and sometimes unpredictable headaches and roadblocks and for businesses and for investors and developers. So supply is the one and only solution. And the data shows us that. The research shows us that. Supply is the issue that unites all sides of these issues together. And, you know, the uniting force in recent years has been the YIMBY movement. It's one of the hottest cultural movements in the country right now. The yes in my backyard, YIMBY is having its moment. Between the best-selling book Abundance by the progressive journalists Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein, which basic thesis is, hey, we need more of stuff that we need. So let's incentivize more of it. Let's make it easier to build. Let's deregulate it. Let's get more housing. That'll help solve housing affordability and availability. Novel idea. It's important. And also seeing real policy wins in states as different as California and Arkansas advancing YIMBY priorities. And now we even have a YIMBY Caucus of members of Congress on the Hill. So again, YIMBYs are having their moment. I think it's cool to see. And my sense is that a lot of people in the rental housing industry aren't even fully aware of this moment that's happening. And I'll tell you that even if you're not a developer, you should understand, even participate in some way, not just because it's a good cause. Obviously, a lot of good causes. This is a good cause, but also because it's in your self-interest. People need housing, and when people can't find housing or if it's not affordable, there's an urge in certain cities, like we see today, to pursue things that are ultimately harmful both to renters and to your business. So I think some people in the industry may have some dated views on YIMBY-ism, and when I started, I think the perception was sometimes, hey, this is kind of some cool ideas, but it's a little bit fringe, not really attuned to how development really works, how it gets done, too focused on just zoning as one single issue. It's obviously that's important, but there's a lot more to it. But I'll tell you, it's matured and it's advanced. It's a real thing now. It's a big tent of activists, advocates, academics, policymakers, and even industry groups and investors and developers. It unites Republicans and Democrats, the left and the right, red and blue. And I tell people this all the time. One of the things I love about housing, it's a truly bipartisan issue. Everyone needs housing. Everyone wants more of it. Everyone wants more affordability. But both sides get it wrong as much as they get it right. And that actually makes it easier to have bipartisan solutions because neither side has a good track record. Neither side owns the truth on this one, right? There's good things on both. And I'll tell you, YIMBY is having its moment, I think, part because it's what you might call progressive capitalism, progressive ideals that engage the private sector as part of the solution rather than demonizing the private sector. So there's something in it for all sides of this. So our guest today is one of the leading voices in the YIMBY movement, Mike Kingsella, the founder and CEO of Up for Growth, an organization with a diverse membership that includes housing advocates and policy folks, as well as private sector developers and investors. And by the way, it's not just for affordable housing, it's even market rate because it's all part of the solution. So stay tuned for that. So we're going to get to a lot of data before we talk to Mike. But first, I want to give big thanks to our sponsors, to JPI, apartment developer. They're used to working with YIMBYs and countering, obviously, sometimes the NIMBY false narratives, trying to get housing built. So shout out to JPI, and also to Madera Residential. All right. Let's kick it off with, here's a chart. We got a few of them today. Again, highlighting where supply is, where it's going, the impact it's having, but what it tells us going forward. So first thing, apartment rents slow where supply goes. It grows where it doesn't. All right. And so looking at the relationship between supply and rents, rents are growing 3, 4, 5, 6% across a lot of the Midwest and Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, where there is no supply, even parts of the West Coast again. These are areas with little supply, and we're seeing good rent growth. Good meaning like sizable rent growth in places like Kansas City, Omaha, Bridgeport, New Haven and Hartford and Connecticut, Providence, Syracuse, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, St. Louis, Columbus. All of these areas seeing pretty sizable rent growth and also no supply. Conversely, rents are falling across a lot of these southern and mountain market states. They're adding significant volumes of supply, led by places like Fort Myers and Austin, Myrtle Beach, Huntsville, Colorado Springs, Phoenix, Denver, Naples, all high supplied markets, and rents are falling as a result. And by the way, you don't always see that type of relationship. I think sometimes you see, some of the Sunbelt haters say, oh yeah, rents always fall in the Sunbelt because of supply. That's not true. Take Austin. Austin's almost always been a leader on supply, but building more than others doesn't mean it's a lot. Remember, more does not equal a lot. Okay, and they're sometimes we conflate those things, right? So Austin was building more than others in the past cycles, but it wasn't enough relative to demand coming in. And so now we're seeing when you truly build a lot, that's what creates this clean relationship between supply and rents. And by the way, it's not just the top of the market. We even see it in Class C. What's interesting is that when you look at this, Class C apartments are falling in higher supplied markets. This data is through March now. What we've seen is some of the, in these low supplied markets I mentioned earlier, like in the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic, we're still seeing 3+% Class C rent growth, Class C being the most affordable market rate stuff. That's, again, Kansas City, Cincinnati, New York, Chicago, Milwaukee, Columbus, et cetera. And then in these high supplied markets, we're seeing Class C rents fall more than 6% in places like Jacksonville, Phoenix, Denver, Fort Myers, and Austin. And again, why is that? It's because what's happening is there's a filtering effect happening in pretty fast, whereas new supply is built, offering concessions, pulling up higher income renters out of the A- and B units. They're moving up. That's creating availability. They're cutting rents to pull in Class C and B-, and they're moving up. And so Class C, they're losing their higher income, middle income renters into the kind of the next tier up. And when Class C has to cut rents to fill up units, they have to cut rents a little more to bring people in who previously couldn't afford any kind of market rate units, because Class C renters do spend a higher share of income on rent. And so that's when sometimes people will say, hey, we don't need more luxury market rate housing. We just need more affordable housing. But they're wrong. You need more of everything. You need affordable, attainable market rate. You need apartments, SFR, for sale homes. You need everything. But you need more market rate because of this effect that it has. You have wealthier people essentially squatting on more affordable units because there's nothing available or little available at the price points they can afford. When you build those upper income level rents, that pulls people up who can't afford those, thereby opening up availability for those who can't. Kind of like the used car market. Somebody who can afford to buy a new car buys a new car. Then you have a used car who's available to someone who needs a car but can't afford a brand new one. And so that is one part of the affordability equation. So yes, you do need more luxury housing because that ultimately helps you solve issues at the lower end. And by the way, it's not just Jay Parsons saying that. It's not just industry people saying that. Lots of research on this. I got a couple highlight on my screen here. Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. I've talked about this one before. How new apartments create opportunities for all. Market rate rental construction in Minneapolis has freed up more affordable homes for households across the income spectrum. Joint Center for Housing Studies of Harvard University said, looking at the current market, they said this may be evidence of filtering, talking about renters moving up market, creating availability at the lower price points. Journal of Economics Journal of Urban Economics, the effect of new market rate housing construction on the low income housing market. Great paper from 2023. And Mercatus Center at George Mason University, price is the medium through which housing filters up and down. All good research. So every time you hear that myth about, hey, we don't need more market rate, we just need affordable, show them that. All right. So more good news here for, I think, renters and developers and investors alike is that we continue to see good wage growth. I talked about this fairly recently. Wage growth outpaced rent growth for the 28th straight month. Again, when that happens, you're widening the demand funnel for who can afford to live in a market rate apartment. That's a win-win for everybody. Most recently, wages up 4.3%, rents up 1.1% for apartments. All right, here's where it's going. Apartment construction is falling fast. We're at a 13-year low, according to RealPage data. Just around 200,000, just above 200,000 units started in the last 12 months. That number might get revised up a bit, but it's still, pretty significantly down from where it was. At the peak, we're starting almost 600,000 units in a trailing 12-month period. So that, of course, points to where completions are going. And all across the country, multifamily building permits are way down. I compared, for those who can see this chart, what it does is what it shows you is a comparison of multifamily permits issued over the last 12 months through March compared to the peak in this cycle. And permitting volumes are down pretty much everywhere by substantial levels compared to the peak. We're down around 50% plus in Dallas and DC and Seattle and Philadelphia, Nashville, Minneapolis, Denver, San Antonio, Jacksonville, Oakland, West Palm, Portland, San Francisco, Fort Lauderdale, St. Louis, San Jose, Baltimore, Richmond, Riverside, Orlando. And so it's not just the Sunbelt market. It's even these Midwest and West Coast markets that weren't building that much to begin with because of what's going on in rates. Again, this happened well before tariffs even became part of the equation here. So it's just harder for new projects to pencil out. Supply is coming down, and pretty soon we'll be talking about undersupply again. So looking at the forecast, we completed 585,000 units last year. We have 431,000 units scheduled to complete this year. By 2026, the forecast puts us below 300,000 units just slightly. And we could be even further down in 2027 if starts continue to drop. Now, I think one thing that's been interesting to see how it plays out is before the tariff stuff came up, I was under the impression, started to think that starts were leveling off. It appeared to be kind of found the bottom, maybe started to move up a little bit. And I still am inclined to think that's the case. I don't think they could fall off dramatically more. But, of course, if there is a material slowdown in the economy, which is a possibility, not a certainty, that could perhaps lead to an even bigger drop-off. And so as you look at the forecast, obviously, because supply is the easiest thing to forecast. I tell people all the time, at least in the near term. It just starts being pushed forward 18, 24 months. So we know at this point what 26 and 27 will look like. It's going to be low supplied years. And then where the economy goes and where rates go can dictate what happens in 28 and 29. Currently, the view is those will be low supply years as well. That could change. Even if it does change, I don't think there's any way, in my personal opinion, we can get supply levels anywhere near the peaks we've seen these last few years. It took a perfect storm of factors to get there, and I don't see that materializing again. Lastly, we look at this across the country. Let's look at scheduled completions these next 12 months versus the prior 12 months. And in most of the country, we have significantly fewer units completing these next 12 months than we had in the 12 months prior. Some exceptions, notably Southern California, LA, and Orange County will have a significant pickup in supply. That's just because it takes longer to get housing built, obviously, in California. And so these are starts that were from a while ago. They're just, taking their dear time getting completed partly due to the regulatory environment out there, things taking longer. But they're also coming from fairly low, kind of starting points as well. So not necessarily a big concern for operators, just more to deal with there. But the bigger story here is that significant drop-offs over the next 12 months in supply across much of the country, especially the Sun Belt and Mountain States where supply has been more elevated. Supply will be completions on a 12-month basis will be down, 25% plus across places like, Dallas, Atlanta, Austin, DC, South Florida, Tampa, Nashville, Raleigh, Denver, Houston, and on down the list. By the way, Phoenix is another one that still has quite a bit of supply to work through, but that's all. It's not going to be seeming acceleration, but just a slower drop off, and that'll be primarily more west side than it is east side. Phoenix is a little bit of a bifurcated market right now. All right, next up, rental housing trivia. All right. So sticking on the YIMBY theme of today's podcast, the question is, in what decade did the term YIMBY, yes, in my backyard, originate? Or at least what's the first known reference that Jay Parsons could find? And so was it the 70s, the 80s, 90s, 2000s, or 2010s? Give that some thought. We'll answer it in a bit. But next, in the news. Okay, I got 4 headlines for us to look at this week. The first one comes from AFIRE, Association for International Real Estate Investors. They've got about 180 institutional investors, pension funds, asset managers, and other leading global organizations from 25 countries, collectively overseeing more than $3 trillion of assets under management. So they released their pulse report recently here in April, and they posted based on a survey of their members in March. So the timing may not fully capture in real time the sentiment influenced by tariffs, but it's still some interesting stuff here. So important caveat, but still interesting. So one of the takeaways here was that U.S. property markets still viewed as a safe investment, only slightly less safe than what was perceived in these rankings this survey in 2024. More than 60% said they plan to increase investments in the U.S. in 2025, compared to less than half saying they'd do the same in non-U.S. investments. Again, this is pre-tariffs, though, probably for most of these survey respondents. Among asset types, multifamily ranked number 1 in both current holdings and in planned additional allocations. More than 60% of respondents wanting to increase allocations in 2025 for multifamily specifically, and that was 20 or more than 20 percentage points higher than any other category. Among the drivers influencing interest in multifamily, 66% of respondents agree that the most important issue in U.S. real estate over the next 5 years will be housing affordability and availability, an increase of more than 5% over 2024. That's a clip. That's an excerpt from the report here. So there you go. Hard to argue with that, and aligns with today's theme. So the most favored individual markets, number 1 was Dallas, followed by New York, Miami, Boston, Atlanta, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle, Charlotte, Nashville, all in the top 10. Now, for those of you who don't know, the AFIRE crowd historically favors the big sexy six global markets. So it's not insignificant here to see places like Dallas, Miami, Atlanta in the top 5, Charlotte, Nashville, top 10. Global investors tend to favor, the big global cities that they know and they visited and they can locate on a map. But it is also notable that they're still bullish on these coastal gateway markets as well. I don't want to downplay that. And so I thought I would be curious to kind of, if they broke this out by property type, I think that might change some of the rankings if we separate apartments from other types of commercial real estate. Next headline comes from NC Newsline. The headline is "Study Should Spur New Approaches to Landlord-Tenant Law." All right. So it's an article about a study, new research from landlord-tenant law experts at the National Legal Services Corporation. And it says, I quote, there are actually relatively few situations in which evictions end up being a win for landlords. The study found that eviction proceedings seldom result in landlords recovering back rent and often end up costing thousands of dollars. Okay, so this research may be counterintuitive to some, but to the vast majority of landlords, quote unquote landlords, property owners, they would tell you the same thing. Evictions are an expensive lose-lose proposition. In most cases, it almost always works out better when you have an honest renter behind on rent, willing to work with you and communicate with you. It makes sense when you can to work with them. At least as a first step, and kind of see if you can work toward getting caught up. And so that part makes sense. Evictions are expensive. They're timely. They take a lot of time. But what academics and advocates never fully contemplate in these things is fraud. That's the bigger problem that rarely gets serious attention from headlines and policymakers, et cetera. It ranges from very sophisticated identity theft, these synthetic IDs. People buy these packages online and then never pay rent using this fake information, all the way to, we have certain cities, obviously in the U.S., that's made rent payment essentially optional for long periods of time. And people just simply choose not to pay rent because there's little incentive to do so. Now, thankfully, it's not the majority. It's a small minority, but it's enough to move the needle for the property owners in some of these cities. But I'll tell you, the vast majority of apartment SFR owners, managers, they'll gladly work with renters who will honestly and willingly work with them to communicate the situation and get caught up on rent through a realistic plan. But you just can't build a plan with someone who's ghosting you or pretending to be someone they're not, or illegally subletting the unit to someone else and not paying you for it. Like those aren't situations you can work through. Next headline comes from the Houston Chronicle. And the headline is under the banner of investigations. Houston Housing Authority stops granting millions in tax breaks for not so affordable apartments. So let me read some of this to you. It says, created under an obscure Texas law, the Public Facility Corporation program allows apartment owners to claim 100% property tax breaks if they agree to reserve half their units as affordable. And it says they did an investigation and found, quote, only about 1% of these apartments are set aside for extremely low-income families. Okay. Few issues with this, okay? First of all, when you say something like obscure law, you're making it sound like something nefarious here. PFCs are no secret. If PFCs are an obscure law, just because most of the general public isn't aware of that term, then you have to define 99.999% of laws as obscure too, okay? Including, pretty much everything. Secondly, you can't just move the goalposts on what is affordable and say because it doesn't meet your standards that it's somehow misbehavior. Okay. It says that only 1% of apartments are set aside for extremely low income families. Well, that wasn't what the goalpost. Now, it's okay to say we want a higher threshold for what counts as affordable under this program. That's a fair argument. We could debate that. But let's be honest about it, not accuse people of wrong behavior for building the middle income housing that the law was intended to get built and that has successfully been built. So here's one of the rubs here that I think that isn't fully appreciated in the right way. And that's that people will say, hey, there's already apartments available at similar rent levels without these tax incentives. And that's true, but here's the nuance here. Here's the big difference. If you look only at this point in time, a time when rents have fallen across Texas due to massive supply outpacing demand, then that's true. It's one thing. But the purpose of the program is not the initial one-time rents. It's to have a long-term impact. What the PFCs do is ensure rents in these communities remain affordable to middle-income renters for the life of the program, which is not the case for apartments built without PFCs. And additionally, here's another important thing that I think no one really talks about. They should. Is there really any doubt at all that more apartments got built because of PFCs, and that in turn put downward pressure on rents for all type of apartments? Because bear in mind, just because you're using a PFC doesn't mean you're building a less quality apartment. You're building a very high quality apartment in most cases that is going to be at a competitive rent level. And so now all of a sudden you're now cheaper than a similar property that doesn't have that. That's going to pull down the rents for properties that don't have the PFC structure in place. So there's a high probability that PFC rents have pulled down market rents through the very existence of the PFC program. And so in some ways, you can argue that PFCs have hurt current owners because it's brought more supply into the market and reduced rents, but that's a win for renters. And so that's why this stuff is really silly to read this. And it takes, again, kind of a lack of intellectual curiosity to really pursue this type of solution, this type of angle here. So that means there's probably, as a result of all this, more units available and affordable to middle-income renters today because of PFCs. And if Texas population keeps growing, and obviously it probably will, that supply is going to be a good thing. Unless, of course, you're more worried about limiting developer profits than you care about creating affordable and attainable housing. So we'll see where this plays out. But it's just kind of, there's this whole thing right now about, more focus on developer profits than about creating housing. Like it's ironic that in Texas, we're seeing the same stuff we saw in New York City when it neutered its successful housing creation program for some of the same reasons, because units weren't, quote, affordable enough. The thing is, you incentivize what you want more of. If you want more affordable and attainable supply, then create incentives that encourage developers to pursue that. And make it possible to pursue that. Remember, they have to raise money from people to fund this. And if they could get a better return sitting on cash or investing in the stock market, they're going to do that. You have to create an attractive incentive and then to be able to fund apartments that can operate at those rent levels. And by the way, for the market rate stuff that is also at those rent levels, that's probably not at the rent levels that were performed by those investors. You have to bear that in mind as well. But let's not, it's so silly to call this stuff loopholes. These are legally, purposely created programs to incentivize the creation of middle income housing. So they're incentives, they're purposely created incentives. So to call it loophole implies some type of exploitive behavior, and that's just dishonest. All right, one more headline. This one comes from the New York Times. Madrid's biggest landlord? U.S. investment firms. As private equity firms assert control over much of Spain's housing, thousands face the threat of eviction. All right, so it does some quick Googling. Shows that 95% of Spain's rental homes are owned by individuals. That fact was not fit to print in an article that works really hard to pin all the blame on Blackstone. They were nice enough to include a statement deep in the article quoting a Blackstone spokeswoman saying their company owns 0.12% of Spain's total supply. Yep, 0.12%. But that doesn't really square with the headline that private equity firms assert control over much of Spain's housing. Much in 0.12%. And the 95% owned by individuals, that just doesn't add up. That's just silly. It's just kind of this reckless pursuit of narrative over the facts. I mean, this kind of stuff drives me crazy. I mean, you find anecdotes, you find cherry-picked data points to support your narrative, easy work. Now, as some of you know, I started my career in mainstream media, spent a few years as a newspaper reporter, and so I have a lot of respect for the many reporters who show intellectual curiosity, work hard amidst what's a very challenging environment in that business, and it is tough. So if I'm critical of reporting on real estate, it's not because I think the mainstream media is all bad and evil and biased, but it's really because there are some, but it's not that that's everywhere. It's just there are bad articles that are rooted in this tunnel vision narrative and lacking, any sort of, again, I use this term again, intellectual curiosity to say, hey, look, I hear this narrative. Is it really true? Or am I just pursuing the same rabbit hole that everyone keeps saying? And when you do that, you're just souring the reputation for the broader media, even if it's unfair. But again, lots of good reporters out there too. So I'm just picking on some examples of some bad stuff. All right. Back to trivia. In what decade did the term YIMBY originate? Correct answer is B, 1980s, or at least as far as I know, the correct answer was 1980s. The first reference I could find was mid-1980s, originating in Southern California as general opposition to NIMBYism. Originally, it was understood to mean yes in many backyards instead of yes in my backyards. That's from a book published in 1991 called, quote, Confronting Regional Challenges, Approaches to Lulus, that's local unwanted land uses, growth and other vexing government problems. And later on, according to Wikipedia, the first political YIMBY group was California YIMBY, and it was founded with the funding of Bay Area tech executives and companies due to, I quote, high housing costs created as a result of the local technology industry adding many more jobs to the region than the number of housing units constructed in the same time span. So now we see the YIMBY movement all over the country, all over the world. We even have a YIMBY Caucus in the U.S. Congress, like I mentioned earlier. So we're going to talk to Mike Kingsella all about that. So that's a good transition to today's interview. Our guest, Mike Kingsella, is the CEO for Up for Growth, whose mission is to, quote, forge policies and partnerships to achieve housing equity, eliminate systematic barriers, and create more homes. Some of you may know Mike because he's done an outstanding job bringing together people across all sides of these issues, from housing advocates and policymakers and researchers to industry groups and developers and investors, all united toward a common goal of getting more homes built for people who need them. So let's welcome in Mike. All right, and we enter the interview portion of today's podcast, and I am honored to welcome in the CEO and founder of Up for Growth, Mike Kingsella. So, Mike, thank you so much for being here.
Hey, Jay, it's great to be here.
All right, so Mike, as I've gotten to know you a little bit over this last year or so, I've been really captivated by some of your story, and so if you don't mind just sharing some of that here, you have a real passion for this movement. I mean, you can't do something like what you do without a real passion for us. So tell us about your story. What events in your life created in you this passion for housing and spurred you to start Up for Growth?
Yeah, thanks, Jay. And, really for all my life, I've been fascinated by cities and the way that cities can work, or in many cases not work, for their communities. And really that attraction to cities and community development drew me to real estate. So I went to Portland State University, studied urban planning and real estate development there. And that was in the early 2000s as Portland's Pearl District and South Waterfront were coming to fruition,
I
seeing
remember that.
and master plan, community development in an urban context, and I caught the bug. And so I very quickly went to work on the finance space initially, working in public finance, a municipal bond underwriter that was actively issuing on behalf of his clients affordable housing bonds. I then moved to San Francisco, Bay Area, worked in debt and equity finance, worked in Big Four consulting at around the time of the global financial crisis, right? So, Jay, I saw the run up in terms of how frothy the markets got, fueled arguably by very easy liquidity and loose underwriting standards. And then the fallout in '07 and '08, all the way through, the blow up at AIG and Lehman Brothers and all the rest. And so, fortuitously, for better or for worse, I ended up at a Big Four accounting firm doing real estate consulting, and ultimately got to work on some of the biggest workouts in the banking sector. Anglo-Irish banks, some of the big commercial and even community banks around the country that were acquiring failed institutions through FDIC purchase assumption transactions. So, long story short, I've worked in one way or another housing for about 20 years. And in about 2016, I was in Portland, Oregon. I had returned home to the Pacific Northwest and had the opportunity to work with Clyde Holland of Holland Partner Group. And there, uh, he's an amazing, a brilliant developer, a very successful entrepreneur, and really civically engaged, and not just in Oregon, but Washington and California and Colorado. And so, in that role, I was able to really sink my teeth into public policy. In fact, together with a number of other developers in the Portland market, formed a group called Oregon Smart Growth that successfully helped the city implement an inclusionary housing policy. And while not perfect, we were able to ensure that the industry had a voice at the table and that the policy was at least workable for the first few years. And we can certainly unpack that later, Jay, if you'd like. But that's where I caught the bug. And the realization was that at that point in time, remember, this was 2016, 2017. And aside from a few Yes in My Backyard groups working locally, there were really no organizations, certainly not at a national level, laser focused on solving America's housing shortage and all of the restrictive and exclusionary and arbitrary barriers that prevent builders from doing their jobs, which is delivering needed homes in the communities that they serve. So that's the origin story of Up for Growth. Clearly passionate about this issue because I believe every American should be able to access opportunity by working hard, by moving where they can utilize their skills and abilities. And frankly, Jay, that's just not possible for far too many Americans because we don't have enough homes in our highly productive job center markets across the U.S. So this isn't just housing advocacy, right? This is economic policy. This is about making an America that is economically competitive on the world stage and where every American has a fighting chance of achieving their goals throughout their life.
I love that. And, anybody who's ever spent 60 seconds with you, Mike, knows that you have a real just mission and passion for this. And I admire that. So you mentioned the Yes in My Backyard, the YIMBY movement. In the early years, I remember it's just kind of a fringe local thing in a few cities, and it's evolved a lot. So how have you seen the YIMBY movement evolve? Because to me, it feels like YIMBY is having its moment. We're seeing progress in places like California, where the NIMBY movement has historically been quite deeply rooted. Just recently, we've seen the release of the book Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, which has been on the bestseller list. And for those who've not heard about it, it's all about, I'm just going to do a very, very short Cliff Notes version here. We should build a lot more housing. That would help everybody out. And even a YIMBY caucus on the Hill. So are we having a moment for YIMBYs?
I'd say so, right? I think the 20, not to get overtly political here, Jay, but I think, no matter which side of the aisle you fall onto, 2024 was a reaction to an America that just isn't working for a lot of people, right? I think about transportation. When it takes 3 different buses to get from your home as a working class single mom to your job. That's not an America that's working for you, right? When you are in bidding wars for Class B apartments, right? Just because there's not enough stock in your community and your cost burdened out of the gates, right? That's not an America that's working for you. When you're paying a sizable chunk, and by the way, I just looked at my utility bill yesterday. I'm paying a sizable chunk of my income on utilities and energy specifically. That's not an America that's working for you. And so, I think what we saw was a real mandate for elected officials, again, left, right, center. This is not a partisan issue. This is an American issue. This is a kitchen table issue. And I think that election was a call to really get back to basics. And that's what we're seeing play out in Congress, in state legislatures, and even in city halls around the country today. So, yeah, I agree with you. We're in a moment. Abundance is the watchword. Abundance of all kinds, but particularly housing is one of the most acute shortages and acute pain points facing Americans, millions of Americans, coast to coast.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned this, but that's what I love about housing issues and really the YIMBY and NIMBY movement is that it's an issue where both sides get it wrong and also have both sides can get it right. Like even talk about abundance, I'm always careful about using the word deregulation because for some people it triggers them in the wrong way. And to others, they're like, absolutely, we need to deregulate things. But at the end of the day, like the goals are similar. Sometimes our word choices are a little bit different. So I think that's allowing for some true bipartisan coalitions that have been hard to come by for other issues where the red and blue camps are more defined. Are you seeing that? And how are you seeing, if so, how are you seeing bipartisanship play out on these housing issues?
Yeah, no doubt. Well, a couple proof points there, Jay. First, on May 28, Up for Growth is hosting a regional pro-housing policy forum where we gather about 100 civic leaders across Phoenix Metro to discuss the growing, the acute housing shortage in the state of Arizona, and specifically delve into what can policymakers, what can communities do about this problem? How can we unlock the productive capacity of the development community so that finally we can achieve housing abundance in a sustainable way along the long run. And, our two headline speakers are former Mayor Giles of Mesa, Arizona, a Republican, and Mayor Corey Woods of Tempe, Arizona, a Dem. And that bipartisan partnership, that agreement in the value of abundance, in the value of public sector working constructively with private sector, this is becoming the consensus. And again, not just local government. So here in DC, you had mentioned our YIMBY Caucus, right? So we worked with a whole host of members of Congress, but notably Congressman Robert Garcia, former mayor, by the way, of Long Beach, California, and Congressman Chuck Edwards in deep red Western North Carolina. And the two of them together have created a caucus of over 40 sitting members of the House of Representatives who have signed on to the mission of more homes for all Americans at all levels of price points and at all shapes and sizes. And so that's the agenda, right? And that's what you're seeing from federal to state to local. When you have Governor DeSantis materially agreeing with Governor Jared Polis of Colorado, you're onto something. And I would just say that the salience of this issue has never been greater. Unfortunately, it's taken us to get to the point where over 50% of renters are cost burdened. To have the political will galvanized to take this issue on. But we are inside that Overton window, that policy window of opportunity. And so our job as advocates are to sustain that energy and really guide policymakers to the policies that work, right? Not just the headlines, but the policies that are grounded in real estate economics and the lived experience of those who get homes out of the ground. To ensure that we're not just passing feel-good bills and grabbing a few headlines, but we're actually shifting that supply curve in the market. And that's the moment we're in, and that's the moment we're excited about.
And I'll say as an aside, as someone who's been to both Long Beach, California, and to Western North Carolina, it's pretty telling that you got people who represent those two areas that come together to do this. Like if people haven't seen the differences, like those are two different worlds. So that's impressive. They've come together.
Well, and Jay, my friend Duke McClarty, who runs a group called Groundworks down in Northwest Arkansas, was just with Governor Huckabee Sanders in Arkansas 2 days ago. With her signing an ADU legalization bill, right?
Wow.
So if we're seeing bills like this passed in Arkansas, I think is clearly not a coastal problem exclusively anymore. So it's definitely promising.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, when you see it in the coastal states making it easier to make it for developers, and you see the interior states like Arkansas allowing for increased densification, like that's a good thing to see. Absolutely. All the way around. All right, so beyond the aligning red and blue, another, I think, really encouraging coalition that, quite frankly, I don't think I hadn't been fully aware of this until more recently. And that's the coalition you're building within industry groups and housing advocacy groups. Two sides that historically have not seen eye to eye. I'll tell you, when I went to New York to participate in one of your events a while back, I was struck by, in the room, you had housing advocates, you had public policy folks, and you had industry groups and developers all together working together around a common cause. So how are you able to pull that off?
Well, it just goes back to our focus, which is we need more homes of all shapes and sizes and at all levels of affordability. We need more multifamily. We need more home ownership opportunities, right? And, and I think we're at a moment where the pain has become so great for too many, right? When we launched Up for Growth, some of our earliest supporters were groups like, usual DC alphabet soup. You've got Enterprise Community Partners and LISC and Habitat for Humanity, and you've got NMHC and NAA and mortgage bankers and the realtors, and recently the home builders have plugged into our NAHB is plugged into our network. And it was an eclectic group, right, of housers, but that was not a new coalition. And where we are today, I would sort of extend this coalition building to civil rights organizations and organizations focused on the environment and land conservation, municipal leagues even, individual cities, counties, regional governments, and groups focused on economic development, workforce training, job creation, healthcare, education. So housing is, as you know, at the base of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so it's no surprise that when we're in a massive housing shortage and America seems unable to meet its housing needs across the entire union, that a lot of stakeholders are going to be increasingly motivated to show up. Now, I would like to sort of drill into one point, Jay, that I think you alluded to, which is sort of the position of the apartment owner, right? Never mind developers. I think, your audience will understand how developers are quite aligned with pro-housing advocates in the sense that everybody wants more homes to be built. If you're an apartment owner and you're clipping your coupon year over year, you might say to yourself, well, why do I care about, more supply? In fact, more supply is going to hurt my business because that means that my rents might not grow at the same rate as they would absent new supply. And it's the old adage, right? It's, that's true until it's not. And I think, as the American populace has seen mounting cost pressures, increasing unaffordability across the board, and of course, rent eats first, there's a growing political market for, frankly, very destructive, counterproductive policies like mandatory inclusionary housing, with no offsets, or rent control, like we saw pass recently up in Montgomery County, Maryland, which I think was a 6% hard cap or 3+ CPI. And the markets, and your audience understands that that's going to curtail capital flows into the region, right? Funding for real estate production is global, and so that then just sets up the environment for rent control to pass. So, in many ways, whether you're an owner, whether you're a developer, you need to care about adequate supply and housing abundance, because the lack of it sets the stage ultimately for a broken housing ecosystem, right? For policies that break the market, and ultimately harm everyone. So, that's the core of the message, and that's where we've seen, folks across the spectrum, stakeholder wise, politically, perspective wise, really galvanize around these common sense proposals to tear down barriers and create more homes.
So I got to say, as you're talking about, the owners versus investors, or I'm sorry, developers, it reminded me of, sometimes you hear the kind of the NIMBY movement will say, hey, look, like if you build more housing, it's just going to make everything more expensive and yada, yada, yada. But what's interesting is like if you follow the publicly traded REITs, they have earnings calls, and a lot of them will publicly state for everybody to hear that, hey, we like New York City, we like, we believe a long-term story around San Francisco, LA, et cetera, because they don't build housing. They don't build enough. There's a structural undersupply, and there's more upward potential for rents. Like, it's no secret, yet there's a view on the other side that just doesn't see that. So you have groups that are openly pursuing that strategy, and really, I think, frankly, taking advantage of the fact that it's really hard to build in certain places.
Yeah, that's right. That's absolutely right. Yeah. And, who benefits when there's a shortage, right? The incumbent interests. And who loses are people who want to move to these places, and competition that wants to be involved in the housing market. And I think it's long past time that we just, recognize that a healthy housing market helps everyone. And so that's where we're seeing the energy move. And that's why we're seeing significant take up on addressing this challenge on the part of the development and the ownership community.
So finishing that thought, then, to your point, what's happened in these markets really since COVID is the acceleration of this, we got to do something, and those led to hardened policies. So you kind of alluded to this. Let's kind of dive into it. It's a harder topic. Obviously, a lot of my audience more industry side, so this is always the frustrating point of them, just feeling like this isn't being resolved enough. And that's this movement toward, eviction moratorium restrictions, rent control. You alluded to good cause eviction, which I will always contend is a misnomer, or at least not what it says it is. It's and all in the name of affordability. And as you know, there's a lot of research that, some of these things tend to backfire on the very people they're intended to protect, but cities pursue them anyway. And on the flip side, we have all this research that shows that when we build a lot of housing, there's a broad benefit to society for all the things that you mentioned earlier. And yet policymakers have not been really willing, at least not enough scale, to pursue what's proven to really work. And I think importantly, as you alluded to, bring all these sides together. So my question to you is, how do we get the focus back on what actually works and what actually brings all these stakeholders together?
We have to build a coalition that is broader than the opposition, right? That's broader than the proponents of these, let's say, quick fix or Band-Aid solutions, right? And I'm even reticent to call them solutions, right? Because, for example, Oregon passed a rent control or a rent stabilization policy a little bit before the onset of the pandemic. And the idea here is tenant protections, right? Ensuring that folks aren't priced out of their communities. If you look at Oregon, pre-imposition of the rent control, rent stabilization policy versus post, we've actually seen the rate of evictions increase over that period of time. The issue behind that are housing providers leaving the rental market, and that's probably good for home ownership. Certainly bad for renters, right? So, a perfect example of an unintended consequence. I believe that across this whole debate, right, across our ecosystem of stakeholders, there is a lot more that folks agree on than they disagree on. And again, what gives me hope is that there is a growing consensus from Governor Gianforte in Montana to Governor Kathy Hochul in New York and many, many states in between, right? 25 governors this year in their state of the state addresses brought up housing as the top issue for 2025 that they are focusing on in terms of policy reform. And so, yes, rent control continues to pose an existential threat to the multifamily industry from an investment and an operations perspective, and poses a threat to the stability of our communities and housing outcomes across our communities. But I think what's interesting is that every single day, every month, every week, we're seeing more energy behind the proactive pro-housing proposals that can substantively move the needle on affordability, on choice, and on availability of housing across our communities. And so that gives me hope that we not only have a path, but we can surpass the energy that has been around rent control over the past few years to policy prescriptions that are going to benefit everyone. And that's where we're pushing.
So let's dig into this a little more, Mike. One of the things I'm noticing as I've talked to people across the country, and I'm sure you do as well, is that it's one thing to tell people, it's like, and they'll agree, yeah, we need more housing, right? But then we get into specific projects, and there's always, like, first it was the weaponization of environmental laws we always heard a lot about. And I feel like one thing we're hearing more and more about now is, maybe I call it like the weaponization of affordability. And by that, what I mean is you have this argument we hear often that say, hey, we don't need more market rate housing. We don't need luxury. We need more affordable housing. And then when you do have an affordable or attainable income restricted component to the project, oftentimes the NIMBY argument we hear is, well, it's not affordable enough.
Right.
So how do we educate policy? And I think you have elected officials, by the way, they want to, they want more housing, but they also trying to placate their constituents. So how do we educate policymakers on the facts around, filtering, the power of supply at all price points, the need for all types of housing, and really encourage them to improve projects when they're getting these type of criticisms?
Well, the nice thing, you had asked earlier about, where the YIMBY movement is and how it has been over that period of time. And I don't think I directly answered that question. And this is a good opportunity to do so, which is, today in 2025, we have the opportunity to build upon the shoulders of giants who worked rigorously, right? Who worked endlessly at the beginning of the movement. And one of those people is actually a former deputy mayor of New York City for economic and community development, Vicky Bean. And she, with Ingrid Gould-Ellen, and others, wrote a paper around 2018 that really questioned: is it possible to address these, process impediments, to address policy barriers, to address the politics of local neighborhoods at City Hall? Because remember, most cities, right, you have elected officials who are beholden to a relatively small group of constituents, and they're up for reelection every 4 years. And so, that's a very difficult, a vote for housing development is a very difficult vote to take in these places. And so that then leads one to ask, what is the role of state government? What is the role of federal government? And so my answer to you on this question about, how do we counter the neighborhood pushback on housing creation is venue change, right? So we have, for the past 8 years, I'd say, seen states from Ohio to Nebraska to Oregon to Maine pass statewide minimum standards for housing, just the same as states regularly set policy for education, right? You still have local control over school board, schools, your local school board, but the state dictates how many days the school should be open. It dictates the accreditation standards for teachers who are employed by these local districts. And so, in the same way, housing is just as significant a policy area, I might argue a bit more significant even than education. And why aren't we treating housing using the same approach as we're treating education policy in this country? And so that's where we've seen the conversation go. Now, sort of the conversation often is, yeah, I want to support housing as an elected official. I get that not having enough housing means we can't attract employers. I get that it means because we have an inadequate supply of rental homes, housing is far too expensive for many in our community. But it's a question of political will and the ability for that elected official to remain elected and to do the day-to-day governing. So again, I think there's a very important and constructive role for state legislatures to play in this conversation, governors for sure, as well as the federal government. And again, that's where we're seeing increasing energy with the launch of the YIMBY Caucus, the reintroduction of the Housing Supply Frameworks Act, and the Identifying Regulatory Barriers to Housing Act. And we could talk more about federal bills, but the point is that up and down the spectrum of up and down levels of government, there's real recognition that this is a problem, and locals left to their own devices have been unable to solve it over the past 10, 20, 30 years.
Yeah, that's a good point. And one thing, by the way, when I have the rare chances I had to talk to city council members, whatnot, different cities, like my thing is like they're getting themselves into a fight every time a multifamily housing project is proposed because there's these hearings and whatnot. I don't understand. It's like I know it's overly simplified, but you can build a single family house and have no hearing at all. You build multifamily, it requires all these steps. Like I wish more cities would look at what can we do as let's have one big fight on what should be allowable, define those standards, and then if you meet those things, you can build it. And then if you, as city councilman, can say, look, my hands are tied. They met the rules that we agreed to. So, but that seems to be, for some reason, too difficult to do. I wish it was easier.
Yeah, we could talk about zoning. We can talk about CEQA abuse. At the heart of it is an overemphasis on discretion and an overemphasis on process over output. Right. And so again, we need to get back to basics. And so, to that question, our advocacy is this: clear and objective standards. By right zoning, right? What you see is what you get. That will unlock, we believe, just that alone will unlock a significant boost in housing production. That's what we've seen in New Rochelle, that did an area-wide environmental study clearing the environmental protection hurdles, implementation of form-based code, and a basket of known clear and objective community benefits. That took a market that was building less than 100 multifamily units per year to production in the thousands. New Rochelle, New York, right? And so, that goes to show that by instituting a set of clear, objective, ministerial processes, you can really turn the spigot on, so to speak, for this needed housing. There's obviously more. There's no silver bullet, but there's a lot that we can do. To your point, to curtail the uncertainty and the discretion that ends up really pushing away housing investment.
Yeah, just one last comment I'm making that before we move on is I think that's why we've seen opportunity zones be successful for investors, because it's a by right incentive. You still have to go with the city stuff, but like the incentive is by right. You don't have to go through this lengthy application process. So, Mike, let's close off with this. For those in the industry who are listening and watching, what can they do to help support the cause if they're not if they're not already involved? And additionally, if not yet convinced, tell us why it's in their best interest to be involved with a group like Up for Growth.
Well, look, I think it's often attributed to Bill Belichick that the best defense is a good offense, right? And with the existential risk of rent control and tenant registries and you name it, Band-Aid solution staring down the legislative agenda in many cities, counties, and state governments, it has never been more important to focus on root cause solutions. So every listener here who cares about a healthy housing market needs to get involved, right? And how can you get involved? And it's difficult, for me to say this without seeming a little bit self-serving, but there are advocacy groups like Up for Growth that are laser focused on solving this issue, the shortage and the regulatory barriers that cause it. That is our job. Every day we wake up thinking about housing supply, we go to bed every single night thinking about solving the housing shortage. And so my call to your listenership is, if your firm, if your organization, if you are not plugged in, get involved. You can sign up for free on the upforgrowth.org website to our member newsletter. You can also join the network and financially support this really critical advocacy. At this moment, when the policy window is open, when there is growing bipartisan consensus, we deeply believe that we can get really important root cause solutions across the finish line. And the last thing I'll say, and this is beyond financial support, this is contribute your expertise. Listen, I know how hard it is to show up in a room with a room full of housing advocates who know nothing about the real estate business and think that developers and investors, the only concern is money in their pockets, right? And having come from the industry, I know quite the opposite is true. Many of us are in this space because we love our communities and we're excited about shaping the future of our neighborhoods, of our states, of our homes. And so the fact is, policymakers are sort of like the drunk that's looking around for their keys under the streetlight because that's the only area that they can find, right? And what they need is that outside perspective of of practitioners who know how the numbers work, who know how housing is financed, who know where the risk, where the choke points, where the impediments are to getting housing out of the ground, and to contribute that wisdom and perspective to the policy making progress. That's a lot of the work that we do here at Up for Growth is pulling together roundtables of developers and identifying not just, out of a list of three, what's your favorite policy, but really how can we, through local, state, federal policy, address very specific impediments, and that role of being an honest broker of policy solutions to electeds who are trying to figure out how to solve their community's interests. That only comes from well-researched and informed advocacy. And so we would invite anyone interested in this topic, interested in solving the housing shortage, to reach out, volunteer your time, get involved, because it's going to take all of us affected by the housing shortage to solve it.
Well, Mike, thank you for your leadership on this issue. Thank you for your voice across the country. And thanks for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you for your leadership. And we'll look forward to continuing the conversation.
Absolutely. And that's a wrap on episode number 32 of the podcast. Big thanks to Mike for joining us today. Big thanks to our sponsors, JPI and Madeira. Thank you to all of you for making us part of your day. We'll see you next week.